TV. In case you missed it, our prior session was the dawn of a smart factory. That session is now archived on SC Biz TV, and you can watch it at your leisure. This session will include the exclusive first presentation of the 2020 South Carolina Aerospace Economic Impact Study. The study is brought to you on behalf of the Council on Competitiveness and completed by Joey Von Nessen. Joey is the state's research economist and works in the Division of Research at the Darla School of Business. Joey also completed the state's Logistics Economic Impact Study, and the results of that study will be presented tomorrow. The presenting sponsors of today's event are Camp Hall and Truist Bank, and I'll take a moment to recognize both. Back in December, BB&T and SunTrust banks combined to become Truist. In so doing, Truist became the sixth largest bank in the United States. The bank is headquartered in uptown Charlotte, and they now have well more than 100 bank locations in South Carolina. We appreciate Truist supporting the conference and supporting today's presentation of the Aerospace Economic Impact Study. Also sponsoring today's event is Camp Hall, located in the greater Charleston area. Recently, Camp Hall was named the 7th best industrial park in the nation by Business Facilities magazine, and they were the only park in the Southeast to be named to the list. Here to say a few words on their behalf is Dan Camp, the Vice President of Real Estate for Santee Cooper, with overall responsibility for Camp Hall. Take it away, Dan.
Manufacturing in the state of South Carolina is a very big deal. It accounts for about 17% of the state's overall gross domestic product and employs about 10% of the overall workforce of the state. Those are not insignificant numbers. Santee Cooper has played a major role in that for many, many decades. And why? Because we want to attract new companies, we want to increase power load, we want to create investment in the state, we want to create tax base and great jobs. So it's all been a big product of that. Santee Cooper's latest efforts in that is Camp Hall. Camp Hall is a major economic development engine for the state of South Carolina. It was purchased to accommodate Volvo, but also to accommodate attracting future and other big manufacturers. Camp Hall's focus is on site readiness. It's having sites available to attract new companies to the state of South Carolina. So we have focused on permits, we've focused on regulatory, so companies can get here and operate as quick as possible. That's our main focus. It's also focused on logistics. Camp Hall is located within 45 minutes of the Port of Charleston and 30 minutes of the new airport, less than 30 minutes from I-95. It also has a brand new interchange directly into Camp Hall. It also has a new rail line being extended by the Department of Commerce. So it has significant logistics as well. It also has workforce, significant workforce. Within 1 hour is 1 million population. Within that is a 500,000 workforce. And within that workforce is growing, about 34 people a day, moving to the Charleston region. And a significant portion of that is manufacturing or related. So I also have substantial training resources to enhance the workforce that are here and to grow the workforce as well. Camp Hall is people focused. And we recognize quickly that to be able to, the companies to be successful, we've got to make sure that that workforce is here, ready, available, and wants to be here at Camp Hall. So we have significant assets and amenities to attract that workforce, to retain that workforce, open space with trails, a village center with recreation elements for relaxation, and also employee services. So someplace can get the services they need to be able to conveniently get to the office and get to their jobs. So we think Camp Hall is the next generation of Commerce Park, and we look forward to having you here.
Thank you again to our sponsors, Camp Hall and Truist Bank. And now presented for the very first time, let's check out the results of the 2020 South Carolina Aerospace Economic Impact Study, presented on behalf of the Council on Competitiveness. Here's state economist Joey Von Nessen. Enjoy.
Hello, and thank you again for attending the 2020 South Carolina Manufacturing Conference and Expo. My name is Joey Von Nessen, and I'm a research economist with the Darla School of Business at the University of South Carolina, and I'm pleased to be with you today to discuss a new impact study that we have conducted over the last several months, documenting the economic impact of the aerospace cluster on the state of South Carolina. We're going to be looking today at several questions that this study has answered, including what the aerospace cluster has seen in terms of growth rates over the last decade, particularly in the last 2 years since our last update of this economic impact study. And we're also going to be looking at the strengths and weaknesses of the cluster and where we see the cluster headed going forward as we move into the 2020s. So there's a lot to talk about over the next few minutes. But before we get started, I want to give you one caveat when we're looking at these numbers. Everything that I'm sharing with you today is all pre-COVID. That is, we'll be looking at trends over the past decade, but the latest data that we have available only go through 2019, only go through calendar year 2019. So that's an important caveat to keep in mind as we look at these trends and as we look at how aerospace has been changing in the most recent few years. So as we get started today and talk about aerospace in South Carolina, the first thing before we get into the results is to actually define what the aerospace cluster is in South Carolina. How do we think about this? How do we create a formal definition that we can then quantify and measure? And this chart here shows you our basic definition, how we categorize aerospace in South Carolina. And you can see here that there are two broad components of the aerospace cluster. Number one, we have the private sector aerospace core, what we define as the aerospace core, what we're calling that, meaning the private sector aerospace component in South Carolina. And then in addition to that, we also have the military component. So South Carolina has 8 major military installations in the state, 4 of which are heavily guided by aerospace and aerospace-related activities and aviation-related activities. And both components are very important and serve as critical components of the aerospace cluster. So we have the private sector aerospace core as well as the military component. And then within the private sector aerospace core, there are 2 broad components there as well. We have aerospace manufacturing, and then as you can see here, we have air transportation and air transportation support services. So these are the broad categories that we're going to be looking at over the next few minutes. This is how we define aerospace in South Carolina. And as we begin looking at these trends and thinking about aerospace in South Carolina, one of the things that we can do is look at trends over the past decade just to see where aerospace has been moving and what's been happening in our previous economic expansion that basically started back in 2009 following the Great Recession, as we all know. And as we look specifically at the aerospace core, the private sector aerospace core, we want to get a feel for how that has been evolving and how that manifests itself within the broader economic context of growth in South Carolina. And this chart gives us one way to actually see that. So if we look at this graph, you can notice that we can track South Carolina employment trends over time. We can look at trends in manufacturing growth over time, and then we can compare those two to the transportation equipment manufacturing sector in South Carolina. We call this informally advanced manufacturing because transportation equipment manufacturing largely encompasses the aerospace sector, the automotive sector, and the tire sector altogether. And so when we just compare, do some basic comparisons in terms of growth patterns over the last decade, one of the things that jumps out at you immediately when you look at this graph is that transportation equipment manufacturing has been growing well in excess of the state average and well in excess of manufacturing as a whole. And in fact, advanced manufacturing or transportation equipment manufacturing, again, we can use those terms somewhat interchangeably, has been a key driver for South Carolina's economy over the past decade. And again, that is very clearly seen when we compare growth rates in transportation equipment manufacturing to manufacturing more broadly and to South Carolina in particular. So the question then is, how does aerospace fit into this picture? And it turns out that aerospace fits into it very significantly. If we just compare the growth rates for aerospace, specifically the aerospace private sector growth, and compare that to transportation equipment manufacturing growth more generally, you can see that aerospace in general is bringing up the industry average. It's bringing up the average of advanced manufacturing and, of course, bringing up the average of South Carolina's employment growth overall. Auto manufacturing is also listed here. You can see that it's doing something very similar. But in general, if we look at advanced manufacturing and particularly aerospace, you can see that it is definitely been bringing up our employment growth trends in South Carolina over the past decade and has been disproportionately contributing to employment growth in our state in a positive way. And these trends are very clear when we just compare that 10.7% compared to South Carolina's growth over the same period over the last decade of 2.2%. Now, if we look at aerospace growth more specifically and break that down, one of the questions that immediately rises is to the extent to which Boeing is contributing to these high employment growth rates overall. And Boeing has clearly been a major contributor to aerospace in South Carolina over the past decade. And so it's important to get a feel for the extent to which Boeing has been a contributor to some of these employment growth trends that we've already observed. This graph here illustrates that specifically. We're able to break out the contribution that Boeing makes by looking at growth patterns in the aerospace core, the private sector aerospace core in South Carolina, and then looking at the private sector aerospace core without Boeing. So if we look at it with and without, we can see what the differences in the growth patterns are. This graph shows us on the left side what's been happening over the last decade, on the right side just over the last 5 years or so. So let's focus first on the left side of your screen there, the left side of the graph, and just compare what's been happening over the last decade. And here very clearly you can see that the growth rates are different when we include or exclude Boeing. However, in both cases, we see that the aerospace core is growing significantly faster than the state as a whole, compared to 1.9% for South Carolina, as you can see there between 2009 and 2019. So what does this tell us? It tells us that Boeing is a critical component of aerospace growth and expansion that South Carolina has seen over the past decade. However, we're also seeing growth independent of Boeing. It's not exclusively about Boeing. Boeing isn't the exclusive driver of these growth trends. We're also seeing sizable growth in the supply chains in South Carolina, and we're also seeing sizable growth in defense contractors that are supporting the military installations that are aerospace and aviation related throughout South Carolina. So both elements are very critical for South Carolina's growth and have been driving these sizable trends that we have seen over the past decade. And that's true whether we're looking at the time period from 2009 to 2019 or whether we're looking more recently between 2014 and 2019. A second way that we can see the growth that aerospace has been experiencing in South Carolina is to look at firm growth patterns as well. And as you can see here, one of the conclusions that we draw is that firms are continuing to anchor and expand in South Carolina. They're being successful. And the way that we see that directly is if we compare, once again, that 10.7% overall growth rate for the aerospace core in South Carolina to the firm growth that we've seen over the same period. So very clearly, you see 10.7% versus 5.8%, so significant positive growth for firms overall as well. However, employment growth has exceeded firm growth by a significant margin. And so what does that imply when we look at these differences? It implies that firms are coming to South Carolina, that they are anchoring here, and that they are expanding. They're basically being successful, and they're scaling up over time. Again, another positive sign for aerospace expansion that we've seen in South Carolina over the past decade. Now, as we look at these employment growth trends even further, one of the other important elements to consider when we're looking at employment growth trends is the secondary economic impacts that they have on the state of South Carolina. And that's what this graph here shows us. It gives us a sense of these secondary employment effects, or what we call the employment multiplier effects. So what are multiplier effects? What are secondary economic impacts? Well, basically, if we think about a particular business or set of businesses, when a business comes to South Carolina and opens up operations or expands its existing operations, one of the things that that business has to do is spend money locally in order to sustain or to create new economic activity. They have to spend money on suppliers and vendors, many of whom are going to be located in South Carolina, and they also have to spend money on additional labor income in particular, which takes the form of wages and salaries. And so when businesses then spend money on suppliers located within South Carolina, those suppliers see an increase in demand. They then have to purchase more materials from their own suppliers, and so you get an iterative process of a supply chain multiplier effect where you see additional rounds of spending that stem off of the original spending from the businesses themselves. Similarly, when you look at additional demand created and additional hiring that occurs as a result of that demand, those workers then spend their wages in the local economy on a number of different goods and services, everything from housing to restaurants and retail to healthcare and other sectors as well. And so all of those businesses see an increase in demand. And so we call that the household spending multiplier, and we combine that with the supply chain multiplier so that you get a significant number of secondary economic effects that result from the initial direct effects from from the company itself or the set of companies that we're looking at. And so that, of course, occurs in every industry, including aerospace. And when we quantify that, it turns out that the employment multiplier that derives from the supply chain spending and the household spending, it turns out that it can be estimated to be 2.7 in South Carolina, meaning that for every 10 jobs that are created by aerospace-related companies, we see another 17 jobs created elsewhere in South Carolina as a result of these secondary multiplier effects. And that multiplier effect itself of 2.7 is quite high. It's significantly higher than the state average multiplier of 1.6, which means that aerospace is not only creating direct jobs through the employment growth rates that we have seen already, but it's also contributing significantly to these secondary employment effects through the employment multiplier effect. So aerospace, in effect, has an ability to scale up employment in ways that few other industries can match, which is another reason why it's such a strong and important component to long-run economic growth in South Carolina. And again, we can see these specific numbers in this graph here, and you can see how the direct employment associated with the private sector aerospace core scales up from close to 23,000 jobs to just over 62,000 jobs when we include these employment multiplier effects. A couple of other components of aerospace in South Carolina that we want to look at in terms of what we've seen over the last decade is to look at some regional concentrations and how that's evolved and where that stands as of 2020. When we look at regional concentrations and we want to get a sense of where aerospace is most concentrated within the state, what economists like to use to measure this is the location quotient phenomenon. And this is a simple metric that allows us to compare the concentration of employees in one region of South Carolina and just compare that to the concentration for the state overall. And just to give you a quick example, as you can see here in Charleston, the percentage of total employees in Charleston that are actively working in aerospace turns out is to be about 2.5%. And that can be compared to the number of employees working in South Carolina overall in aerospace. What percentage is that? Turns out that's right at 1%. And so when we divide that out, you see a location quotient of 2.5, which simply means that the concentration of aerospace workers in Charleston is about 2.5 times higher than it is for the state as a whole. So this is just a simple definition, and the location quotient gives us a fairly straightforward way to compare the regional concentrations across the state. So when we apply this and actually look at different regions of South Carolina, you'll see the location quotients here, and they're ranked obviously from 1 to 8. These are the major regions of South Carolina defined at the county level, and you can see they're in different shades here. And one of the things I want to draw your attention to is the fact that the location quotients are highest in Charleston and in the upstate. Now, this is certainly not surprising, particularly for Charleston, given Boeing's presence there. But the upstate has a sizable contribution to aerospace as well, largely because we see manufacturing that is concentrated in the upstate region of South Carolina, and we have a lot of contractors, private sector contractors that are serving not only the private sector aerospace firms like Boeing, but also serving the military installations located throughout South Carolina. So both Charleston and the upstate have a very high concentration of aerospace activity in South Carolina and private sector aerospace activity in South Carolina. Similarly, we can look at the concentration of firms, in this case private sector firms in South Carolina. These percentages are broken down, and once again, you can see that the highest percentages of private sector firms by region, ranked number 1 and 2, are the upstate and Charleston, and for very similar reasons. As we mentioned, we see a strong aerospace cluster anchored in Charleston, and we also see a large number of firms and a lot of activity concentrated in the upstate where manufacturing is more generally concentrated within South Carolina as a whole. And you can also see the other regional breakdowns around South Carolina, again, looking at where aerospace is most concentrated throughout the state. All right, so let's change gears a little bit then, and let's actually talk about the economic impact of aerospace in South Carolina. We've talked about trends, what's been happening over the last decade. We've talked about the significant employment growth that aerospace has been contributing to South Carolina. and a significant multiplier effect as well, and how aerospace has a fairly unique contribution to South Carolina simply because of its high employment growth rates as well as its very strong employment multiplier effects. Both of those are important, and both of those have contributed to the strong growth that aerospace has seen and that South Carolina has seen more generally. But now let's talk about the absolute numbers. Let's talk about what the economic impact of aerospace is on South Carolina and where we stand in 2020. So as we do that, first we have to take a look at the direct employment effects. So where do these economic impacts come from? And here we can see both the private sector and the military component. As we talked about before, both are critical elements here. And the direct employment effects you can see on the left side of your screen there, the Aerospace Corps contributing close to 23,000 employees, 22,785, an ongoing employment base in South Carolina, the private sector aerospace employment base in South Carolina. And then we can look at the 4 major military installations in South Carolina that are mostly aerospace or aviation based. You see here the Shaw Air Force Base, the McEntire Joint National Guard Base, Joint Base Charleston, and the Beaufort Marine Corps Air Station, all contributing a sizable employment to South Carolina as a whole. We can also see on the right side of your screen the significant increase that the private sector aerospace Corps has seen over the last 2+ decades. So going from about 3,200 employees back in 1995 up to about 23,000, again, that 22,785, the current direct employment number in terms of where we stand using 2019 data, where we stand at the beginning of 2020. So what does this imply in terms of the total economic impact for the state of South Carolina? These are the big numbers here. These are the primary estimates that we use to summarize the economic impact of aerospace in South Carolina. And as you can see, it's a significant number, $28.8 billion annually. That is the total economic activity that is supported in South Carolina either directly or indirectly by the state's aerospace cluster. Now, what does that translate to in terms of employment? You can see here about 136,000 jobs. So 136,000 jobs in South Carolina, again, can be attributed directly or indirectly to the aerospace cluster. And that's associated with about $11 billion in total employment compensation that are tied directly, of course, to those 136,000 employees. You can also see the breakouts between the direct effects and the multiplier effects. We've already talked about what constitutes those multiplier effects, both the supply chain multiplier as well as the household spending multiplier that generates those secondary effects and that provide a significant part of this total impact, of this $28.8 billion impact for South Carolina. Now, the military and the private sector component, both important for aerospace in South Carolina. And as you can see here, the military component serves as slightly over half of that, or contributes slightly over half of that, of 54.4%, again, as of the end of 2019 or the beginning of 2020. And the Aerospace Corps, as a result, contributing about 45.6%. However, if we track this growth over time, one of the things that you'll notice is that the private sector aerospace corps is becoming more and more critical to aerospace as we have moved forward over the past decade. You can see it's up from contributing about 23% of the total impact in 2009 to close to 46% today. So the private sector aerospace component of the aerospace cluster in South Carolina has been steadily and significantly growing over the past decade, which we can clearly observe here. And so that's going to continue to change and continue to grow in the coming decade. We can also break these numbers down at the regional level, just as we did looking at the location quotients and at the firm breakdown. This gives you the specific numbers in terms of the economic impact by region. Once again, the 8 major regions in South Carolina that we break down, and you can see them ranked here by overall economic output and also the corresponding unemployment and total employee compensation here. Now, one caveat to note is that this ranking here includes all of aerospace in South Carolina, including the military component as well. Whereas before, when we were looking at location quotients, there we were just looking at the private sector component, so that the Aero Corps that we keep coming back to and talking about. In this case, we're talking about all of aerospace in South Carolina, so the rankings are a little bit different. You'll notice the Midlands now is ranked number 2. And we can actually break this down even further and highlight here the differences in the Aerospace Corps and the military employment, so you can see the breakdowns and what percentage each contributes in in each of these local areas in South Carolina. And one I'll point out just as an example is to look at the Midlands here, where you can see that about 92% of the aerospace contribution, or 92% of Aerospace's contribution to the Midlands region of South Carolina actually comes from military activities or support of military activities. So it's very different depending on the region of the state that we look at. So that's an important component when we're looking at these numbers as well. Another way to break down these estimates, these total economic impact estimates, is also to look at the wages and the wages associated with these jobs, both the direct and the indirect jobs as well. Because when we look at aerospace, again, more broadly, we've already talked about the employment quantity and how aerospace contributes a sizable volume of employment to South Carolina. We've seen that in terms of the employment growth rates. We've seen that in terms of the employment multiplier effect. And we've talked about how aerospace has a disproportionately large contribution to South Carolina in terms of overall employment volume. But employment quality matters as well. It's not just about quantity, it's also about quality, and wages are the way that one way to gauge employment quality. And so that's what this graph shows here, an actual breakdown that summarizes some of the wage numbers for aerospace-related jobs in South Carolina. And as you can see, aerospace offers a sizable wage premium over the average job in South Carolina. Just compare these straight numbers, about $81,000 per year compared to around $45,000 per year, so a significant premium there. Also a premium over the average manufacturing job in South Carolina, again averaging right at $59,609. So this means that manufacturing generally and aerospace manufacturing specifically are both bringing up the average wage of South Carolina. So not only are we seeing positive contributions from aerospace in terms of employment quantity, we're also seeing it in terms of employment quality as well. So both matter, and we're seeing contributions in both ways. We can also look at the contribution of aerospace to South Carolina in terms of tax revenue. So how is it contributing to the general funds? One way that we do this is to take these economic impact estimates that we have seen. We can translate those into GDP estimates. So what are the contributions to GDP, which you can see here, and then translate that into annual tax revenue based on historical relationships between growth in GDP in South Carolina, or gross state product, and the corresponding growth in tax revenue, because the two, of course, are tied together. And what we find is that currently we're seeing an average annual contribution to the general fund in South Carolina of about $735 million per year as a result of activities associated with the aerospace cluster. So once again, very significant for South Carolina as a whole, and we can see this contribution very directly when we quantify the impact on tax revenue. Now, let's change gears for the last few minutes that I'm with you today to talk a bit more about the future and about maximizing the potential of aerospace in South Carolina. We've talked in a fair amount of detail of the growth patterns that we've seen over the past decade, particularly what's been happening over the last 2 years. We've talked about what the current economic impact in South Carolina is in terms of both the military component and the private sector component of aerospace. But it's important to continue to think forward and to be forward-looking and to think about maximizing the potential of aerospace as we move ahead. So in my last remaining minutes with you today, I want to share with you what that looks like and ways that we can begin thinking about that. So first, let's just recap. If we look at the cumulative employment growth patterns for aerospace in South Carolina since 2009, once again, we can see that that has been increasing steadily, but that it has been increasing more during the early parts of the previous expansion than the later parts. So really before and after 2015, we see a bit of a difference there. And we've already documented this in a couple of different ways earlier in the presentation today. But again, how do we think about improving the rate of growth going forward, and what are ways that we can think about in terms of strategizing how to do that? Well, one way is to look at what's been most successful and what has been growing at the fastest and slowest rates. What have been the strengths and weaknesses of aerospace growth over the last decade? Now, if we look at aerospace manufacturing in particular, we can break that down into 3 components, as you see here: aircraft manufacturing, engine manufacturing, and auxiliary equipment manufacturing, or just auxiliary manufacturing as a whole. And one of the things that we want to see is where we have experienced the most growth and the least growth. And so we can document that and actually look specifically at the numbers. And what you'll see is that the major area where South Carolina has not been growing in the past decade is in this auxiliary manufacturing category, firms within auxiliary manufacturing. We've seen significant positive growth for aircraft manufacturing, for engine and engine parts manufacturing, but less so for these other firms. And so when we actually do a comparison then and look at the supply chain for aerospace in South Carolina and compare that to supply chains in other well-established aerospace clusters in the United States, especially Washington State, what we find is that the major weakness in South Carolina, not surprisingly, is in this category. And so that's where, in a manner of speaking, we can get the biggest bang for the buck in terms of scaling up the supply chain, in terms of being able to increase our overall activity via increasing the supply chain in South Carolina. And so one thing we can do then is to actually estimate what the supply chain, what the economic impact in South Carolina would look like if we did see a significant scaling up of the supply chain to a level that might be expected if we were similar to other major aerospace clusters in the United States. So for a specific exercise here that you can see here in this table here, if we have the South Carolina supply chain potential, that is documenting the increased economic impact that we would likely see in South Carolina if our supply chain were expanded to be comparable to what Washington State is currently observing. Now, this does not mean that we see any changes in the manufacturers themselves. This only looks at scaling up the supply chain based on our current level of manufacturing today. If we were to do that, what would be the increase in economic activity in South Carolina? And as you can see, the supply chain potential, when scaled up, shows that we would see an increase in the overall economic impact in South Carolina of about 10%. About a 10% increase in aerospace overall, which you can see is to the tune of about 1.7 billion or about 6,400 jobs. So this is a significant area where we have potential in South Carolina going forward and where we could see some potential scaling up of economic activity in our state that would be, once again, significant in terms of the sheer volume of economic activity. So, to summarize, a few key takeaways that I want to recap with you today. First of all, if we look at the total economic impact that we have talked about in 2020, before COVID hit, we see an impact of $28.8 billion in South Carolina, the total economic impact of the aerospace cluster. That is $28.8 billion worth of economic activity can be traced directly or indirectly to aerospace-related activities in the state, and that corresponds, as you see here, to about 136,000 jobs annually. In addition, we've seen a strong employment multiplier effect of 2.7, meaning that aerospace has the ability to scale up employment in South Carolina in ways that few other industries can do, and that is a very powerful combination when you combine a high multiplier effect, a high employment multiplier effect with high overall employment growth rates, which, as we have seen, have been very significant over the past decade, about 10.7% for the private sector aerospace core compared to just 2% for the state of South Carolina as a whole. And then the final takeaway, with this sizable presence, with these strong impacts, we can see here that over the next decade, aerospace will continue to have a disproportionately large effect on the state of South Carolina and have large positive effects as we see the industry continue to grow as we move forward over the next decade. And one final comment that I think is also important to recognize here when we look at growth over the next decade, aerospace, we often think of aerospace as being related to new production or new activity, new production activity. But there's also a significant aftermarket in aerospace as well, because when we are building airplanes, we have to think of those as durable goods that last 30, 40 plus years or even longer. And so over their lifespan, these aircraft have to be maintained and they have to be repaired. And so there is a strong aftermarket and a maintenance and repair market to do those exact activities. And that is also part of the aerospace cluster in South Carolina. So as we look ahead, there are going to be synergies that continue to form here as we see more companies locate in South Carolina to do new production and more locate here to do aftermarket maintenance and repair. And both of those are going to contribute to our growth going forward. So we have to look at all elements of aerospace, both the private sector and all elements in the military as well. Thank you very much for your attention today. It's been a pleasure to be with you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Welcome back. That was the state's research economist Joey Von Nessen presenting the 2020 Aerospace Economic Impact Study on behalf of the Council on Competitiveness. I'm now joined by Steve Towns. Steve is the CEO and founder of Ranger Aerospace and ACL Airshop and a longtime fixture in this state's aerospace industry. He's also a past chairman of the Council's Aerospace Group, actually the inaugural chairman. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I thought so. How are you, man?
I'm fine, thank you.
It's good to have you here. I've been waiting to talk to you. This is big stuff, man. Joey had a ton of good information there. Aerospace, big business, right?
Very big business. Huge economic impact.
$29 billion?
That's a lot.
That's a lot of money, right? How many people? 136,000 jobs?
Roughly, that's correct.
Yeah, and that includes a qualifier, a 2.7 multiplier.
That's right.
Explain to me how that works.
Well, aerospace has a good spillover effect for the supply chains and other related industries. So for every aerospace job in South Carolina, it creates 2.7 other jobs.
So the 136,000 includes the multiplier.
That's correct, yes.
The past decade, aerospace, this surprises me. Aerospace since 2009, and of course we're stopping in 2019, which I suppose is a good thing so we don't have COVID impact that's in there. But it has grown 10.7%. Auto manufacturing, conversely, 11.1%. Who'd have thunk it, right?
Two great industries in our state.
Right. 23,000 core aero jobs in the state. Tell me the difference between a core aero job and all those 130,000 others.
Well, you have a large population of jobs at our 4 big air bases across the state. That counts in the population as well, naturally. Out of the 23,000, then there are supplier jobs and spillover jobs that occur because of those companies operating in the state. Rick, when I think about jobs in our industry, I think about clustering. Mm-hmm. Our entire industry for 100 years has had clusters in various parts of the country. Now, the strongest growing cluster in our industry in the world is the southeastern USA, and South Carolina is right in the middle of that cluster. So it is all about jobs, and it's about supply chain aggregation. The more bigger companies that put footprints into the southeast USA, like Boeing is doing, the more suppliers that will aggregate around those large footprints.
Speaking of Boeing, of course, we all know what the recent announcement was. We're consolidating here, and they're moving 1,000 jobs-ish, give or take, when the time comes, from the Washington State plant to here. What is that going to do to these numbers the next time we look at an impact study?
The next time we look at the study, it's going to keep rising because of what I just said about supply chain aggregation and
Right.
jobs, jobs, jobs. I said something somewhat radical about 5 years ago. I said, in 10 years, Charleston Harbor is going to look just like Puget Sound. And I meant that figuratively about jobs growth and jobs migration. And what we're seeing now, it's smart business by Boeing to do what they're doing. And it's also essential because of the overall impact of COVID on the entire air transport industry worldwide.
Right. I'm not sure that they had much of a choice at the time, given what's going on. I suppose what is the loss of Washington State is our gain at this time. But I'm not expecting, and you tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm not expecting those 1,000 employees to happen anytime soon as Boeing still tries to probably get out of a little tough financial situation. What do you think?
Well, I'm not on the board of directors of Boeing,
of course.
But I can say just as an industry player that it will take some time. The job migration will happen as the economy comes back, as the COVID impact dissipates. Boeing has slowed down its production rates in Charleston, so their overall population will adjust to the slowed rates of production. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, by moving the entire program into Charleston,
right,
it will eventually be a very positive impact.
Right. When I was listening to Joey talk, there was another thing that surprised me, and that is how much military plays a part. And of course I knew it did, but until you see the statistics on it, I suppose when I saw them on paper, it was a little surprising to me. Military, 54% of the cluster in terms of economic impact, and the Aero Corps, 46%. That was surprising to me. You?
Not really surprising. If you think about the aerospace industry, so many of the products find their way into military service. So these long-lasting, long-life products, which are flown and operated by the Air Force and our other branches of service, are a natural place for those jobs also to aggregate.
Right. Makes sense. This is another thing that I thought you would enjoy talking about. Private sector firms in South Carolina. We're seeing a lot of aerospace impact, the bulk of it happening in the Charleston area and the Low Country area. But when we look at private sector firms, Charleston, 21% of private sector firms, and if you want to count the rest of the Low Country, that's 28%. But here in the little old upstate, and right now we're recording in Greenville, South Carolina, 33% in the upstate. Talk about that.
Well, our company is a living example of that.
That's right.
We have a company here headquartered in Greenville called ACL Air Shop, and that company in the last 4 years has doubled its global service footprint for the air cargo industry. And we built a new factory here in Greenville to support that growth. We could have built that factory any place. So I'd like to say that that is sort of a poster child for what's going on in the industry overall and in the upstate in particular. Lots of companies, mostly small to medium-sized companies, that are part of that supply chain aggregation. That's it. That's what's happening.
I knew it was, and I knew you'd want to talk about that, and I wouldn't have brought it up had I not thought that your companies were a great example of it. Steve, I appreciate it, but before we leave, give me a big takeaway from this.
One big takeaway is job growth starts also with workforce education. South Carolina Aerospace, this initiative that we started 5 or 6 years ago, is a triad partnership between industry, government, and education. It has to be all three. So 4 years ago, one of us on the South Carolina board made a brazen dare. We said, we don't have any aviation high schools in the entire South Carolina, entire state of South Carolina. Shouldn't we have at least one?
Yeah.
And so in coordination with the 16 technical colleges, Apprenticeship SC, Ready SC, the Department of Commerce, the Department of Education, and the Department of Aeronautics, we dared ourselves to make that happen. We now have 7 aviation high schools in the state of South Carolina, and as far as I'm concerned, that's a real good start.
I think it is a good start, and we will be talking to the folks at the technical college system tomorrow, including President Tim Hardy, and we'll be talking about apprenticeship with Amy Firestone tomorrow as well. So be sure to check all that, because I'm sure aerospace will come up.
Hey Rick, there is one more big takeaway, and it's this. As an employer and a CEO in the aerospace industry, I can say to students and young people, if you learn how to work in this industry, it's very likely you'll have a well-paid job for life.
All right, folks, what I'm going to do is we're going to take a quick commercial break, and I'm going to come back and I'm going to be with Stephen Astemborski. Stephen is the director of SC Aerospace at the Council on Competitiveness. Don't go anywhere. Folks, welcome back. Thanks to Steve Towns, who joined us just a little bit ago. I am now joined by Stephen Astemborski. Stephen is the director of SC Aerospace, of course, working for the South Carolina Council on Competitiveness. Stephen, how are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm doing well. I appreciate you coming by.
Yes, thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. I tell you, Stephen, before we get into a conversation, I want to hear just for a second from your boss, Susie Shannon, who we have heard from before in this conference, is the CEO at the South Carolina Council on Competitiveness, and she couldn't be here. She's over in Columbia. Again, we're filming in Greenville, but she did provide some comments as related to the aerospace study. So let's hear what Susie had to say. Be right back.
The South Carolina Council on Competitiveness is dedicated to advancing South Carolina's long-term economic competitiveness through actionable research, supportive industry clusters that provide us with a competitive advantage, and education and workforce development initiatives. So one of our clusters, SC Aerospace, is led by a team directed by Stephen Astemborski, who wakes up each day focused on growing the aerospace ecosystem in our state. We are seeing significant tangible results from our efforts. Aerospace in South Carolina has been growing at a faster pace and faster than other industries within the state as well. At the council, we work closely with schools, state agencies, and the private sector to advance and market aerospace on that global stage. You know, one day we are digging into aerospace related employment numbers, and the next we are helping to fashion an aerospace exhibit at a children's museum. So in our research projects, like the more than $32 billion logistics economic impact study we released at the beginning of October, in which you'll learn more about with our Director of Logistics, Taylor Jackson, tomorrow, and the aerospace study, which you will hear about more in a few minutes, we are embarking on both exploration and application of what we need to know and why we need to know it to help our companies and state to thrive. Our research work is intended not just to market all the wonderful things happening in South Carolina, but also to look for that kind of that three-letter word, the aha moment, on which we can help companies and the state develop solutions for our economy to thrive.
All right, thank you, Susie, and welcome back. And again, I'm here with Stephen Astemborski, Director of SC Aerospace at the Council. Stephen, we just heard Joey Von Nessen's presentation on the economic impact of aerospace in South Carolina, and I got to tell you, I told Steve Towns this when he was here, it has more economic impact than even I had anticipated when we look at those numbers. How about you?
Yes, I think it's incredible. I mean, it's we're really a growing state. The whole southeast region is becoming a cluster, and we're not just a national leader. We're becoming an international leader. And I think it's a testament to the hard work that our state has done to build the infrastructure, to attract the businesses. But it's really a testament to the workers that come in day after day, whether they're building jets or they're building commercial wide body aircraft, or they're servicing aircraft, retrofitting aircraft. Really, the workers that come in day to day and work hard and put out quality products is why the industry is the way it is and continues to grow.
You know, one of the things that really surprised me was that the economic impact of the aerospace industry is rivaling the impact that auto manufacturing is having on the state. Matter of fact, they're very close. I think auto is about 11.1% growth in employment over the last 10 years, and aerospace at about 10.7%. How do you feel about that?
I think it's great. I mean, we want this area to be known as, the whole state to be known as a auto and an aero leader, and to see that we're keeping pace. I mean, we know the good story, obviously, with BMW here in Greenville, largest plant in the BMW plant in the world, and so to see that Aero has been able to keep pace with that is just incredible.
Right. So Boeing makes a big announcement here recently, of course, consolidating part of their plan in Washington State for the production of the 787 Dreamliner, and potentially bringing up to 1,000 new jobs here. I guess we'll have to see actually how many make that transition in terms of jobs. Tell me about Boeing and what's the future look like?
I mean, the future is great. It's obviously it's difficult circumstances with the announcement being made, and we understand how hard it is for them to move away from Puget Sound with their history there. But it's an opportunity for South Carolina, and as the consolidation happens, Now with the economic impact study, we have a good baseline to understand the strength of our supply chain and what weaknesses we may have, and now go out and try to attract those other companies where we haven't quite seen the growth that support a wide body jet. Try to get those companies so that we have an even more diverse supply chain network to support Boeing, and hope to see future growth as the industry starts to recover.
Employment, 136,000 people have an aerospace-related job in South Carolina. And not only do we have a lot of jobs, but they pay well.
Yes.
Aerospace job average annual salary is about 80,000, while manufacturing, 60,000, and the average job in South Carolina right now pays 45,000. That's we need more people in aerospace to take those big jobs, right?
We do, and I mean the reason that it's so high is because building aircraft or maintaining aircraft, it's hard work. It's a difficult, hard labor intensive, and hard intellectually. Technically challenging, very, and that's why. One of the reasons that we think that South Carolina is poised so well is because we now have the infrastructure to be able to support that. Whether we're talking about the University of South Carolina's McNair Center and the bachelor's and master's degrees that they have in aeronautical engineering, or we're talking about our technical colleges and the advanced manufacturing work and degrees that our students can get there, and even just in our K through 12 system with the aviation high schools that we have, the 7 high schools that have a Southeast Regional Education Board curriculum where students can learn aeronautical principles, aeronautical engineering principles, and then apply those when they get out into the workforce and come in very well prepared and do a good, high-paying job.
Right. Stephen, I appreciate you. I'm going to get you out of here on one last question. Give me a big takeaway from this presentation. What is it that, if you're going to walk away with one thing you want to tell the world, what might that be?
I think that the big takeaway, Rick, is just how diverse our state is. We're, as we saw, we're not just military aviation, but we're military and commercial, the Aero Corps that Joey talked about. And within that Aero Corps, we're not just Boeing or we're not just Lockheed Martin, but we're spread out with composites and with aftermarket and all these different areas. It's we're really a good place for the aerospace industry, and we hope people come land here.
Thank you, Stephen. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Rick.
Folks, that is Stephen Astemborski. He is the Director of SC Aerospace for the Council on Competitiveness. And that concludes this session at the Manufacturing Conference here on SC Biz TV. Next up is Session 6, and that is Collaboration Produces Innovation. And we're going to be talking to our friends over at SCRA about a bunch of good stuff. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.